Hi, everyone. Okay. So hello, everyone. Welcome to the 14th episode of our webinar series for the Sustainability Working Group at NCOSI. Today, we have two presenters from DTU in Copenhagen, Bjoern and Andrea Paulillo. I hope I get that right, Andrea. It will be a 1-hour session with Q&A included, and I'll start with Bjoern and let you introduce yourself, please, to the group and the incredible work you do on absolute sustainability metrics. And you're from the Absolute Sustainability Center, I think, which is coming out of the DTU and still a very young institution, as far as I understand. So we're looking forward to learn more from you. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Yes, welcome everyone. Thanks for having me. I will share my screen and then introduce absolute environmental sustainability assessment to you. And after that, I'll pass over the presenting stick, let's say, to my colleague Andrea Paulillo from University College London, who will go more into details with this guidance document that we have been developing and are still working on finalizing the final version. So he has a presentation specifically on that, and I'll give some more broad context before Andrea. So I will share now my screen. Okay, you should see it in full screen mode now. So I'll continue unless I hear any objections.
Oh, that's fine. Works well.
Good. Yes. The title of my presentation is simply Life Cycle Assessment and Absolute Environmental Sustainability Assessment. Not very sexy title, but it's the purpose is really just to introduce you to those fairly basic concepts before Andrea can give a more in-depth presentation on our guidance document. So the basics of LCA or life cycle assessment. I expect some of you to already be quite familiar with this, but probably not everyone. So that's why I'm going through the basics. So the life cycle approach to environmental assessments is really sort of a systems approach, which is why I think it sort of fits well with the INCO's mission from what I understand, your organization. And so LCA has 3 core characteristics. First, it sees a product as a system that's delivering a function. Second, it's when you are going to do the environmental assessment of a product, it maps all the processes taking part in this system perspective. So this product system from cradle to grave, as we like to say. And third, it includes all relevant environmental problems. So all the ways that such a product system is impacting the environment, not only climate change, which is something that other tools often tend to focus on. And just to go a little bit more in detail with these 3 core characteristics. So the first one about seeing the product as a system. It's something that's necessary for many reasons, but one of them is to ensure comparability between different products or different product configurations. Because if you get the question, oh, is it better to use a single-use cup, for example, versus a durable cup that you wash in your hand versus a durable cup that you wash in a dishwasher. In order to truly make these things comparable, you need to make sure that you all tie it up to the function that the product is delivering, which, for example, could be to contain a certain amount of warm beverage for a certain amount of for a certain frequency over a certain amount of period. And once you have established that, then you can sort of identify, okay, what are then the product flows that are needed for each of the scenarios. There's a certain amount of plastic cups, maybe a little bit more than 1,000 that is needed per year here. Over here, it's more about assuming that the cup will last for 4 years. It will be 1/4 of a cup plus warm water and detergent. And that's just one example of how it's really important to be systematic and look at the function that your product delivers if you want to compare different configurations of products on the environmental assessment side. The second characteristics about mapping all processes taking part in the product system. I don't know if you've seen diagrams like that before. The text is even in Danish, but you can imagine what's going on. The idea is that you have a product that is some sort of, in this case, it's a food product that comes in a packaging. And then you can both map the processes that takes place in the production of the food itself, starting with some agriculture and also some resources, maybe mineral resources for the packaging. And then there's different processing, there's transport, there's like storage in the fridge at the supermarket, storage at the fridge at home. Then there's some sort of closing the loop, certain things that are recycled, other things that are going to waste management, for example, incineration, etc., etc. And then going to the third characteristics about including all relevant environmental impacts or environmental problems. Once you have defined this product system composed of all these processes, then what you do is that you try to quantify within each individual process in your product system, you try to quantify what are the flows to and from the environment. So what are the pollutants that are released and what are the resources that are consumed? And that ends up in a very, very long list. And this is just a very small version of such a list, but typically it can be more than maybe 500 items because there are so many different pollutants and different resources. Also, if you consider locations, using water in one region versus another region, etc. And that can be quite hard to draw conclusions on. Let's say you have a 500 item long list for the single-use cup and another 500 item long list for the mug, and unless all the resource flows are lower in one scenario than another, you cannot really conclude which one is better for the environment. And that's why that brings us to the last point about covering all environmental problems, because another important step of life cycle assessment is to convert all these long lists of individual pollutants and resource consumptions into a shorter list of typically 10 or so environmental problems. So CO2, methane, N2O, fluorinated gases, they all go to climate change. So you can summarize, you can sort of simplify this list of items by coming up with these environmental indicators for each environmental problem. And then you can better compare your different product configurations or product scenarios against each other. You can see, okay, how does one product do and how do they compare on climate change? How do they compare on nitrogen emissions, etc.? To give an example to make things a little simpler, this is actually from a Canadian report from Quebec. So maybe some of you are familiar with the CIREC in Quebec. They made the study some years ago. They were actually commissioned by the city of Montreal to compare different product solutions for shopping bags. So basically for carrying items that you buy in stores, carrying them home with you. And one way that they represented the results, so basically all of these different plastic solutions, all these different grocery bag solutions, they were identified as alternatives to this reference grocery bag, which was like kind of a thin single-use plastic bag that at the time you would just get the cleric in the store would just like pack items for you in this single-use plastic bag. So it was very standardized. It was just, that was the normal solution across the stores in the city. And then they commissioned the study, this life cycle system study, to see, well, what could alternatives be and how would they perform relative to the single-use plastic. And so this is actually a chart showing, so across the different environmental problems, climate change, water, scarcity, et cetera, they sort of summarized into a single score, and they calculated, well, for these different alternatives to the single-use plastic bag, how many times do we need to use them in order for the environmental performance to be better than for the single-use plastic norm? And so just to give you an example, they found that a cotton bag actually needs to be used something like 700 or 900 times in order for it to outperform the single-use plastic bag. And for a paper bag, it would need to be reused around 20 times. It's important with some disclaimers here. So the first one is that this applies to Quebec specifically, and the results for various reasons cannot necessarily be transferred directly to another geographical setting. And also, it doesn't include things like littering and microplastics, simply because the methods, at least at the time the study was done, didn't exist for including that. And of course, you can argue that in some way favors the plastic solutions, because this is where you have greater issues with littering and microplastics than you have with paper, for example, or with like durable bags like cotton. But that's just to show you one example of what type of questions LCA can be used to answer. Now I'm gonna explain you why, even though I think there's a lot of good things about LCA, I'll try to convince you why the normal way of doing LCA is actually not enough, is to some extent insufficient. And that is because if you think about different products that you surround yourselves with in your home, at your work, just in general in your life, probably you will realize that a lot of them have become more sort of efficient over time, at least when we talk energy, like the provisioning of heating, indoor heating, or provisioning of light, or like computing power. It's crazy how efficient it is today compared to what it used to be hundreds, or well, in the case of computers, decades ago, right? And of course, when things become more energy efficient, they also tend to become better for the environment. It's not always like that, but oftentimes there's a correlation. So there's an indication that the environmental impacts per product has been sort of decreasing in general. But even though that has happened, the state of the environment is not doing too well. This is from the last planetary health check done by some of the Planetary Boundaries people, where there are some different indications of the state of the environment. For example, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, concentration of nitrous oxides, concentration of methane, ocean acidification, emissions of nitrogen to coastal zones, etc., etc. And you see that for quite a lot of them, it's really going in quite the wrong direction. Maybe the only one that looks good is stratospheric ozone depletion, because the problem has kind of peaked according to most studies, and the stratospheric ozone layer seems to be slowly recovering after the CFC gases were banned. But other than that, it's really not looking too good. So on one hand, we're doing better and better every year on the product level, but at the global scale of the system, we're doing kind of worse and worse, at least for most environmental problems that we can think of. And the reason for that, of course, is that we have a growing population, and we also have a growing consumption that grows even faster than the population, meaning that we have had a sort of increase in consumption per capita when you average across the planet. So this is really the driving force. So more and more products are being produced and consumed every year. So even though each product tends to have environmental impacts that are lower than maybe its predecessors, the fact that the volume is growing so fast means that this is why we see this problematic states to the left here. And it's also important to say that even though, I mean, in a way, it's a good story that we have become richer per person on the planet, because this is what's indicated here. You know, the amount of consumption has grown faster than the population has grown. And so in a way, you could say, well, that's a good thing. It means more people are living good, comfortable lives and meeting their needs, etc. But unfortunately, this increase in consumption has not happened in an equal way across people on the planet. And one way to see that is that actually undernourishment is still quite a big issue globally, and it's a quite persistent issue. So if you look at the world here, if we go back to the year 2000, something like 13% of the global population were undernourished. And then things actually seemed to improve until around 10 years ago, where they started stagnating. And around the pandemic years, problems, undernourishment became a bigger problem, and so on. And in certain regions of the world, it seems to actually be increasing. So that's really the big challenge we're in globally, that we are destroying our environments. We are becoming richer on average per person, but there's a substantial amount of people on the planet that are not consuming enough to even meet their basic needs, such as not not starve. So this is really the big challenge, and to sort of go back to the product level, if you draw the big chart like this, you say, well, this is economic activity. You know, this that can be a metric for either global consumption or global production. You know, those two things are matching. If we then have a relative decoupling of the environmental burdens from our products, then we are in a situation where the environmental problems are still increasing. They're just not increasing as fast as the economic activity. And I think that's actually the case for a lot of the environmental problems you could see earlier on the charts, like except maybe for the ozone one, most of them exhibited this pattern. But actually, what we need to do is that, if we want to increase production and consumption, if this is the model that we go after for meeting everyone's needs, you know, pursuing growth, etc., then it's not enough to just improve a little bit every year at the product level. You actually need to improve so much at the product level that you both have what we call absolute and sufficient decoupling of your environmental impacts, environmental burdens from the economic activity. So you need to sort of get back within the carrying capacities of the planet. And oftentimes I think if you just do normal LCA, you're sort of promoting this as being sustainability, when actually what you need is this down here. And so, to say that in another way, how LCA has been applied historically has typically been the relative perspective, where we compare product X with product Y, and then if product X has a lower environmental impact than product Y, then we maybe put some sort of label on it saying this is a sustainable product or something like that. That is, it's not, at least in Europe and Denmark, we are moving a bit away from that because of certain consumer protection rules that it would be sort of misleading for companies to claim that their product is sustainable just by the fact that it has a lower impact than another product. But these are sort of recent trends. If you go back 10 years, we saw this everywhere in Europe. And I think outside Europe, you still have this sort of mindset today, saying the least bad product is the one we call sustainable. But actually what we need is an absolute perspective, and that may lead us to concluding that neither of the products are sustainable, and that product X needs to reduce by this much, and product Y needs to reduce by that much to be sort of compatible with a sustainable society. Yeah, and just the last couple of slides. So what AESA is really absolute environmental sustainability assessment. The sort of the core feature of it is to set targets that are based on equitable assignments or sharings of a carrying capacity. And here the carrying capacity is exemplified by the safe operating space within the planetary boundaries concept, but carrying capacities could also be quantified in different ways, and you could have carrying capacities for things that are not included in the planetary boundaries framework, like mineral resource depletion, etc. And so you consider this a kind of global resource, and then you devise different ways of translating, of allocating your global resources into actors and activities at other scales. It could be countries, could be companies, could even be products. And then the idea is simply that you do your life cycle assessment, you compare the burden of your product or whichever system you're studying to its allocated share, and then you conclude based on that, okay, and you do that for each environmental problem. So you do it for climate change, you do another assessment for water, you do a third assessment for nitrogen, etc. And then only if in all cases the burden is within the allocated share, then you can say that your product is actually sustainable in an absolute sense. I can tell you that almost never happens. And if the other thing is the case, if the other case is true, where the burden is higher than the allocated share, well, then your product is not sustainable from an absolute perspective, and you can then calculate these. You could call them science-based reduction targets, to use the language of SBTi. So yeah, that's really the sort of core of absolute sustainability assessment, and also the underlying LCA method. If you want to know more, we just published this paper about a month ago in Environmental Research Letters. It's an open access paper, so you can access it without paying anything. And in the paper, we both give a sort of broad characterization of where absolute sustainability assessment is today, and then we propose a research agenda for how the methods can be strengthened and improved in the future, to sort of make them even stronger and more relevant to decision makers, for example, in companies or in government. And with that, I think I pass the torch over to you, Andrea. Unless, well, I don't know if it makes sense that we have. My feeling is it's probably better to go straight to Andrea's presentation and then have comments afterwards.
Yes, agreed.
Great. I will then stop sharing.
Perfect. Let me share my screen. Let's see. All right. So can you see the slides?
Not yet. We see the presentation mode.
Okay. Now?
Sorry. No, the presenter mode is what I was trying to say. So now it's fine. Perfect.
Now it's fine. Perfect. All right. Okay. So thank you very much, Anas, for the very nice and detailed introduction. So I'm Andrea Paulillo. I am a lecturer in sustainable chemical engineering at University College London. And in the next 10 to 15 minutes, I will be introducing the first detailed and broadly applicable guidance that we developed on absolute environmental sustainability assessment. And I will be talking about not only where you can find it, but why we did that, how it is structured, and what it is, how it can basically be used. So let's start from the basics, where you can find this guidance. So this guidance can be found, there is a nice QR code on the right-hand side where you can download the report, and there is a web link there. This is the cover page of the guidance. It's called, the full title is The Guidance for Applying Absolute Environmental Sustainability Assessment on Activities at Different Scales. And This is a beta version. I will be explaining why this is so later on. And this is basically the web page where you can find information on the abstract, the different authors, and the link basically to download it. But this is recorded in any case, so basically you will have the links to download it at hand. So why did we want to develop a guidance? So I think Anna explained very well why AESA is a very interesting and very powerful tool to move beyond the way we have historically assessed the environmental performance of products and technologies systems in general. And for these reasons, AESA has attracted really a lot of interest in academia, and we've seen that with a significant increase in the number of papers applying or developing the methodology, but also in the industrial world via our collaborations that we have, as well as in governments. And because of this interest, we have realized, we have noticed a proliferation of different approaches to implement or operationalize AESA. For example, we have noticed very inconsistent terminologies, as well as the actual practical methods in which basically the AESA was carried out. And the problem with that is that this was making different studies to some extent incomparable, or even different applications potentially leading to different or even opposite results. And all of these we felt was risked hindering the mainstreaming of the methodology within, but also, and most importantly, beyond the academic world. So what is then the aim of this guidance? We had two main objectives. On the one hand, we wanted to try and synthesize or rather harmonize the existing academic literature on AESA into a single document, so that anybody who wanted to basically get started with it, they had one basically document to start with. And the other, and perhaps the most important on the right-hand side, was to show how to carry out an AESA in practice, and most importantly, in an accessible way, so that basically not only academic researchers, but also practitioners in industry could basically do so. And we did that via by including a number of examples, worked out examples at different scales, and I will be showing later on what these examples are. So how did we develop this? So this was a joint effort. It was a joint effort with the Denmark Technical University, when Anna says, and other two co-authors, myself, University College London, and the Joint Research Center of the European Commission with other three authors. And what was the basis for us to develop this guidance? So basically our basis, I don't know how that happened. So our basis was our collective knowledge of the scientific literature on AESA, because we have either been developing the methodologies in the past years, or applying it, but also our knowledge on standards on, for example, life cycle assessment. But also we had experience in teaching AESA to students, supervising students in conducting some of their case studies, or even conducting the studies by ourselves. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the report was published last year, and it was published as a beta version. Why we did so? Because we felt, or we wanted really, to collect feedback from experts or other practitioners around the world on whether this was indeed valuable and whether we were missing some points, how we could improve it. But also because we wanted to have time to test the guidance and the framework in case studies, in teaching again, and in research, with the idea to then publish a final version of this guidance that would have incorporated this feedback that we were to collect. So how is this guidance structured? So the guidance is basically develops or proposes a framework for conducting AESA from start to end. So the idea is really to shepherd the practitioners in the way they frame the study, all the way to quantifying or generating the results and interpreting them. And basically this framework, there will be another slide where it is a bit larger, but it's divided into 3 phases with a number of steps, 9 in total and 11 sub-steps. And then the framework is explained via a number of illustrative examples which are at different scales. So one example is more at a product level, looking at residential buildings in Denmark. The second examples look at an entire company, particularly an Indian cement company, so a larger scale. And the third example looks at the entire, basically, consumption, the total consumption in the European Union. All these three studies were conducted using life cycle assessment. We also added a fourth example as an annex, which again is on the this is on the UK consumption, but here the idea was not to use life cycle assessment, but kind of we could call it a twin tool or an alternative tool, which is called environmentally extended input-output analysis. So this, unlike LCA, environmental extended input-output analysis typically use a larger scale, for example, the consumption of an entire country. So this slide shows the framework bit more in a larger view. And again, this is to show you the different steps that the practitioner needs to take to basically conduct an AESA. So there are 3 phases. The first phase is about estimating the environmental burdens or the environmental impacts of the system that is being investigated. And that can be done basically following life cycle assessment or environmental extended input-output analysis. So you go all the way from defining the goal of your assessment to collecting the data and then quantifying the environmental impacts. The second phase, which is the most one of the most important and very critical to AESA, is to define but then allocate the global carrying capacities, the global planetary boundaries to the system that we are investigating, which again could be the cement company, a residential building, or the EU consumption. As you might guess, there are a wide number of ways to do that, and some ways could be perhaps more ethical than others. And finally, we basically compare the impacts against the allocated carrying capacities, and then we interpret our results, and we understand at that point whether the system is or not environmentally sustainable, and what could be the reductions needed to make that system environmentally sustainable. Right, so looking at the first phase, which is about quantifying the environmental impacts, so this phase was really conceived following existing LCA standard. So really here we didn't reinvent the wheels. Rather, we adapted the LCA standardized methodology to AESA. One key element of novelty is that we made these guidance and the framework not only applicable to LCA, but also, as I mentioned, to other environmental accounting approaches like environmental extended input-output analysis, so that to ensure that it can be applied in really a wide array of cases. So we also needed to make some normative choices in the way the environmental accounting approaches were, particularly LCA, were employed, and particularly we recommended that only one. So typically LCA, there are two different competing approaches to LCA. We won't have the time to go into the details of this, but one approach is called attribution LCA and the other is called consequential LCA. Perhaps the consequential LCA is the most easy to explain. In a consequential LCA, we look at the consequences of a decision. So if I decide to build a plant, say, I don't know, a wind farm, a wind turbine, what are the environmental consequences of these decisions? Attribution LCA looks more at apportioning the global environmental impacts to a system. Now, we don't need to go into the details, but what suffices to say is that we basically restricted the attribution LCA to AESA for some methodological reasons. And as Anand mentioned, in LCA we have a number of environmental categories that are typically assessed or applied in LCA. And in this phase, what we do is that we restrict the selection of these environmental categories to those that are then aligned with the carrying capacity. So we need to ensure that whatever we are calculating can then be compared against the limit with that basically we have. So the second phase is all about allocating carrying capacities. Again, as I mentioned, this is perhaps the most critical phase. So the carrying capacities, if you think about the CO2 budget, the carbon budget, they are typically, although not always, defined at the global level. So we need to find a way to distribute these capacities among all the different anthropogenic systems or even countries, for example. And the choice of how we do it is value-based, right? There is no right or wrong way to do it. There are simply a number of ways which reflect different perspectives. What is important, though, is that the way you do it is very likely to affect the results of AESA. So in this slide, on the left-hand side, I included a table that you can find in the guidance with a number of allocation principles that could be employed. And particularly the top four ones, these four are those that are most typically applied in the literature. To give an example, if we apply an equal per capita principle, it means that every person on the planet receives the same share of the carrying capacity, or for example, the carbon budget. If we apply a grandfathering approach, we are basically apportioning the carrying capacity based on the what percentage of the total emissions, say CO2 emissions, are currently being emitted by a system. So for example, this means that if the EU currently emits 5% of total CO2 emissions, the EU is then entitled to 5% of the carbon budget. And of course, the opposite to that is historical responsibility, where you are apportioned, the share of the carrying capacities is inversely proportional to how much you have emitted in the past. And finally, economic value, basically we share the carrying capacities according to the economic value being generated by a system, that whether that is a country or an industry. And on the right-hand side, we try to show that how these principles can then be implemented and how they enable basically to go from a global to a country, to a person, to a product, or to an industry, and the different combinations that are possible. So in the final phase C, it's all about interpreting the results. So what we do, we compare the environmental impacts we quantified in phase 1 against the allocated carrying capacities that we quantified in phase B. And what we do this comparison phase carrying capacity by carrying capacity. And we interpret the results using a strong sustainability perspective. This means that even if our system exceeds the one carrying capacities, one allocated carrying capacity, this is sufficient to declare the system environmentally unsustainable. So the exceedance of one carrying capacity is again sufficient to, even though all the other carrying capacities are not being exceeded by a wide margin, even though only one is exceeded, that is sufficient. The reason being that all the carrying capacities have, let's say, equal importance, and all of them have the ability, if they exceeded, to destabilize the Earth system. And that's why we suggest this strong sustainability perspective. And this shows an example of the results that we obtained for the EU consumption. So here you have basically the different carrying capacities. So in this case, these are the planetary boundaries. And basically, for each of them, if the dots on the right-hand side of this vertical line, it means that the carrying capacities, the allocated carrying capacities, is being exceeded by X much. For example, for climate change, if we look at this one, so the EU consumption is exceeding its allocated share by somewhere between, I would say this is a bit lower than 10 times all the way to 100 times. And this variability that you see there is due to the allocation principle being chosen. And you can see how important this is, because there is a variability of almost 2 orders of magnitude. And so this brings an important point, which I also alluded to at the beginning. The AESA results are really sensitive to the allocation principle, which is why we strongly recommend that any AESA study carries out a sensitivity analysis, meaning that they apply more than one principle. And this really contributes to making the results more robust. As I mentioned, we developed this guidance as a beta version, and then we we collected feedback from the community. So we got a total of 36 comments, which is very good, considering that the community is, this is an emerging methodology. And the majority of them were from university, although we received some feedback from consultancy industry and NGOs, and the vast majority from Europe. What we really found is that most respondents found the guidance valuable and accessible, which is great. And we got some very interesting feedback, for example, on how to position this document, whether this is to be more of a guidance with more stricter recommendations of how the different steps are to be carried out, or it is more towards a synthesis of the state of the art. Other comments looked at how it can be used, the decision context, and some specific modeling approaches. For example, we had some comments regarding the consequential approach and whether that should indeed be allowed. We had a number of comments on the carrying capacities, and particularly on the allocation. So what are how these principles can be implemented in practice? What are the equations that one should use and the data sources? And indeed, we are working a lot on this. And overall, the goal that we have is to try and balance between developing a guidance that is very firm with some very normative choices and leaving some methodological freedom, because we acknowledge that AESA is an emerging methodology, and we do not want to constrain the development of this methodology by making this guidance too strict or too constrained. So what is next? So we expect to develop and publish the final version of the guidance around perhaps after mid-2026. And really, we think that this guidance will represent the first step towards standardization of this methodology. And a bit we explain why, and we argue why this is important in this paper, in this column actually that we published a few months ago with all the coders of the guidance. And we also launched a consensus process for the allocation of the carrying capacity. for how to carry out really the allocation of carrying capacities in AESA. And that is really was due to the number of feedback we received, particularly on this step. And the idea there is to identify what principles are sufficiently mature to support recommended practice, and then basically to develop this recommended practice, which means for example, the equations and the data requirements for each principle. And the first step of this consensus process will be a meeting at the CITEC that will be held during the CITEC Europe meeting on the 21st of May in Maastricht, Netherlands. And that, I believe, is the end of the presentation. Thank you very much, and very much looking forward to questions. And let me stop sharing. Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea and Anders. This is absolutely fascinating. I'm glad to see how far this has come, and the feedback you got so far and everything you put us in front of. So happy to take questions. And what I meant to say is looking forward to the next steps of the guidance you have prepared. So
thank you.
And Anders, I really appreciated your introduction, because I asked Anders also to do a little bit of a general introduction, because we have people who are not LCA experts and who come from completely different domains to our meetings. I'm opening to questions. So there was somebody. Hamza, you start, please.
Yeah, I can start. Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. It was very interesting, and my question, I have many questions.
So your microphone is very low.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hamza is
now
sick,
it's better.
So when you come closer to the screen. That's excellent. So
to the screen.
Yes, this is
Okay.
works. This works. This works.
It's good.
It should work with microphone. Test, test, test. You hear me now?
Yes, we do.
Okay. Yeah, first question. So you mentioned like that's probably that's going like toward like standardization. Are you like already in contact with the ISO 1400 standard, and how are they taking it, and also and so on? Are there like plans for alignment or something like that?
No, the short answer, if I may, Anas, is no. At least I don't think, as far as I know, I am not. I don't know whether Anas has done any progress in this.
No. Well, we had a couple of meetings with the Danish chapter of ISO, because they are interested in following this development of absolute environmental sustainability assessment, and they also ask us questions. Okay, when do you think it's the right time for a standard, and what kind of standard, etc. But for the moment, yeah, we're focusing on this this guidance document that doesn't have the same let's say meaning as an ISO standard, but is still something that could potentially be a stepping stone towards it later. But we thought it was important to get some basic, let's say, yeah, methodological norms and steps and terminology and so on clarified before we potentially go through ISO. Yeah, but good question.
Okay. Good. Does anyone have a question, or can I continue?
I was going to offer you the next question. Okay, Alain is unmuting, so maybe Alain, you have a question?
Yes, but maybe a basic and naive one. Thank you very much for the presentation. It was very interesting. But I'm thinking about maybe it's a generic question about LCA also, but about this top-down cascading, and how can you take into account sort of market dynamics? I mean, for products that will be sold either one exemplary or the 1,000 or 1 billion, how do you take this into account? When the method cascades from top to down the product requirements in terms of limits.
Maybe I can answer that. You can always compliment me, Andrea. Yeah. So typically, I think Andrea showed that in the guidance document we have this. We've sort of conceptualized these 8 different principles for allocating a global carrying capacity down to the level of your system that you're studying, and that can be all the way down to a product. It doesn't have to be. It can also be to a company or a country or something like that. But it can go all the way down to a product. And I think so most of the principles that goes all the way down to a product in the equations you apply for operationalizing these principles, you will have to provide some information about total volumes of products. So, for example, if you take I think the economic value principle was one of the ones Andrea went through in the table, and there would be just as a simple example. We might also see sometimes you combine an equal per capita with economic value. So first you do equal per capita to, let's say, Denmark, which is the country I'm in. And then from there on, you do an economic value-based allocation down to a product level. And for that second step, you would actually need to consider, well, what is total value consumption or value generation in the Danish society. And that can be measured, for example, by the gross domestic product, because that's an indication of total production and consumption within the country. And so basically, the higher your gross domestic product is, the less of the share goes to an individual unit of a product. So in that sense, the total consumption is also considered when you allocate down to an individual product. So obviously, the more total consumption level, the less allocation to an individual product, and that is also why it's always going to be more challenging to meet a reduction target at the product level in an economy that is growing rapidly than in an economy that follows more like a post growth paradigm.
Okay. Now, I was thinking also about the rebound effect that maybe we cannot anticipate when you calculate top down, and so maybe this is a second order phenomena when you have more general figures. And yeah,
that is a good point, and I can just quickly comment on that because as was mentioned earlier, I'm part of the Center for Absolute Sustainability at DTU, and we have a sort of sister project, you might call it, which is called Reboundless, and which is chaired by Professor Daniela Pigoso, my close colleague.
And she's presenting on Monday.
Yeah,
oh, right.
I was about to send the invite.
Vaguely also there was a connection to this group, but she's doing this Reboundless project, and she's actually trying to understand how to sort of design, both in product design but also in policy design, how to design in a way so that you minimize the risk of rebound effects. And so we are very much in dialogue with her and taking what's coming out of the project. But it's a very good.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Fantastic. So we have Bruce next, and I think John afterwards.
Thank you very much for the presentation. When you brought in carrying capacity and talking about products, I started thinking about how does this relate to the government NDCs and their approach to sustainability, and should they be involved in looking at the wider carrying capacity issue, and maybe they would benefit from some of the work. And it seems like it needs a holistic view of carrying capacity across not just products, but consumption and all the other things. So have you considered that?
Consider getting in touch with governments.
Well, looking at a wider carrying capacity, which includes more than just products, because that seems to be, I mean, the allocation of that seems to be quite an interesting challenge especially when we have a lot of government activity going on in setting up the targets for the government sustainability programs and their need to balance carrying capacity as well.
Oh, that's a good point. Anastasia, you want to go?
Yeah, no, but sorry, I didn't. If you had a really
Please, I can compliment.
No, but it's a good point because on one hand you have the Paris Agreement has this temperature or warming limit, which can be understood as a carrying capacity for climate change. There would be certain scientists arguing that it should be even lower. Like if you take the planetary boundaries concept, they say, okay, we actually shouldn't warm the planet more than 1 degree. So in that sense, the Paris temperature limit is a bit less precautionary. But still, there are a lot of AESA methods that take the Paris temperature limit, so 1.5 to 2 degrees as their carrying capacity. And then you're right that there are these NDCs, so the nationally determined contributions, where governments have already submitted to UN FCCC that this is what our reduction targets are, and so on. I think the problem with using the NDCs as carrying capacities is that they are like an aggregation. They are not ambitious enough for the Paris temperature or warming limit. I think if you sort of aggregate all NDCs in the world, it corresponds to maybe 3 degrees of warming or something like that. So far overshooting the warming limit. But I mean there is research literature that tries to say, okay, how can these NDCs be let's say improved based on absolute environmental sustainability assessments. So in aggregate, the ambition levels need to increase. That's clear. But how what are the countries that should maybe increase their ambitions the most? And this is what these allocation principles can try to answer.
Just to clarify my comment.
Yeah,
I think your thinking about these carrying capacities is actually very good. If there's some way of getting that into the calculation of the NDCs and having a country allocation of carrying capacity, you might find that you get a better take-up.
Yeah, I can comment on this. I think like countries already like do that. So at least like in Germany, there is like, for example, climate plan with like the carrying capacity of the different industry sectors and so on. And there is like a budget of how much CO2 is allowed to be emitted, but there is no consequences of going beyond that.
Yeah, and I think that's the connection between these NDCs and the government targets and the LCA and how it gets brought into a corporation or a company looking at a product.
Yeah.
And it may be that is a connection which will make the addition of the carrying capacity on the LCA and the idea of these absolute targets much more effective. That's all my comment was. Thank you.
If I can add to that, no, that's a very interesting comment. One thing, I mean, from our point of view, it would be wonderful if we could convince the government to use this methodology to guide their policy making. I mean, that would be really wonderful. But that would require convincing on two things. One is that their current targets, climate targets, are already, as Anas was mentioning, too high. So we should basically make them we should reduce our total carbon budget significantly. And we're already struggling with net zero climate targets today. Reducing that even further, restricting that even further would be quite challenging. And secondly, on top of that, we should convince them that it's not only climate, but there are a number of other emissions that should be treated in the same way with limits. And that would constrain even further how we can grow, develop our economy, which ultimately is, unfortunately, the main primary objective of governments. So that's where I think it's the main challenge. Secondly, you were mentioning NDCs and how they work already in that way, which they are, there is this allocation. One other important bit is each country will tend to do what? To choose the allocation that favors their conditions, right? And I can make many examples of that. So the moment you set your NDC or the equivalent NDC for carrying capacities without having an international political agreement on which allocation principle should be implemented, the total NDCs will not sum up to the carrying capacities, because each of them will be picking whatever allocation principle which again favors them. So all of this is to say that technically what there should be is an equivalent to the Paris Agreement that extends the focus beyond climate change to all the carrying capacities. And the new process that then at that point the NDC would be then set by countries in line with this overarching framework. But unfortunately, I don't see that. I don't want to be pessimistic, so I'll stop there.
No, that's your challenge. And I believe you've got my point, and I really appreciate that. And I like the addition you've done to the LCA and the absolute. So thank you.
Thank you.
Fantastic. So we have Ali, who has a very specific question in the chat, which I've been trying to wrap my mind around, which I prefer, Ali, you to ask it, please, in person. Ali, are you able to unmute? Or yes, there you are. So we don't hear you. I can see you unmuted, but we don't hear you, Ali. So I think it doesn't look as if Ali can, he has microphone issues. If I look at his comment here, did you have time to read it? Maybe, Anders, it's referring to slide number 23. He's asking, Ali, in case it works, please come and interrupt me. I'm going to read it out. So how do you envision defining this threshold for absolute sustainability? As you noted, achieving absolute sustainability requires simultaneously addressing all relevant criteria. This suggests that boundaries and constraints must be established for each criterion, which may vary significantly across different products. Without clearly defined thresholds, it becomes difficult to determine whether true sustainability has been achieved. Additionally, based on my experience, failing to account for uncertainties in assessments can lead to solutions that lack resilience. Deterministic approaches may provide only temporary outcomes, which could deviate substantially from absolute sustainability when uncertainties arise. With this in mind, it seems that the concept presented in slide 23 could also benefit from explicitly incorporating a threshold that ensures the resilience of sustainable solutions. So
I can try to answer that. Slide 23 was the one where I just had an image of the planetary boundaries and then a cake that was like divided into country, company, and product. And I think, that was a sort of a simplified way of showing how AESA works. And as Andrea was detailing in his part of the presentation, we are actually heavily encouraging users to not just calculate deterministically, so not just calculate one cake portion, but as instead trying out these different allocation principles to give an indication about how sensitive your result and conclusion of your sustainability assessment is to the choice of allocation, which is inherently normative. So yeah, the cake needs to be cut in different ways, and results reflect that. So, and I'm not really sure about the part about your question that's about the resilience, because I'm not sure how you define that, because I think it can have different definitions. But at least the part about uncertainty, I would say, yes, of course, you follow what Andrea was saying, and my slide 23 was just showing the concept without the sort of the complexity of uncertainty that we also need to address.
Okay, excellent. Bjoern, you had a question before, because we are already over time, and I really appreciate the discussion and everything everybody says and having these fantastic presentations and experts. But Bjoern, if you can, yeah, there you are.
Okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Wonderful presentations. Thank you so much. It's very frustrating, particularly if you live in the United States, that you just really can't count on the government to do anything. And in fact, it seems to do actually the opposite of what actually needs to be done all the time. So given that, I don't really count on the government helping in any way. So the only thing I can really count on is the economic system and the marketplace, which does seem to have an impact. I won't go any further into that. But if we had a way that we could sort of show what the impact that different organizations, different companies had, then that could influence shareholders and could influence the PE ratios, which could influence behaviors. It's the only thing that I could imagine that's actually has an opportunity or a possibility of doing something like that. The other thing is GDP is such a strange metric because it doesn't count so much of the labor that we actually do. So if you take care of your own kids, that doesn't count. If you cook your own meals, that doesn't count. It's all consumption, consumption, consumption. So in the end, we're going to have to get away from GDP as a measurement because it's causing us to want to do the wrong thing. So my question is it a possibility that we can get some way of actually, looking at different corporations and what their impact actually is so that we can report it in an objective way, that we can actually use that information to affect our purchasing and investment behavior?
Andrea, I want to give you a chance because I've been talking way too much, but
I can start again and say something quickly. That the first thing that came to my mind, which I think it's so there are really 2 points. So the short answer is yes, we can do that. The challenge, I'll start with the challenge. The challenge being that with this methodology needs to mature. So that's what we are doing is all the efforts we are putting together is to ensure or to make it quicker that we get to a methodology that is mature enough for standardization and therefore mainstreaming. And once we get there, then basically we can start as far as I'm concerned, be basically applied at scale. Now, is there a way to then report the environmental impacts of companies in the absolute sense, so that basically that could, as you mentioned, affect their share values and so on and so forth? Well, the technically is already the global reporting initiative. So any sustainability reporting standard already does that. And there are many of these standards that basically quantify or basically that report, I would say, in a standardized way, the environmental impact and socioeconomic impacts of companies alongside their financial performance. So that already exists. I'm not sure to what extent it is actually implemented in the US, but definitely in Europe, it is something that is growing. So at that point, what is needed is just to ensure that this methodology, absolute environmental sustainability assessment, is incorporated into these standards, and then communicated it to basically shareholders and then ultimately to stakeholders. Anas.
Yeah, just to add to that, I just put a link in the chat that is more on related to what you mentioned, John, on communication to consumers, or basically, disclosure to consumers. Because there are some people that have this idea to just like companies have to put nutritional information on food, like how much fat, how much sugar, and what percentage of your daily recommended intake does it take up. there's this idea to do the same for environmental impacts, and also showing you, well, if you buy this product, then maybe you used 60% of your daily water footprint quota, for example, and 40% of your daily carbon quota, like that. So there's some ideas for bringing this into consumer communication. On the other, I think you also mentioned investors, shareholders, things like that. And I think actually, if you look at the science-based targets initiative, it seems that a big driver for why now it's more than 10,000 companies globally that have set a science-based target. And from what I know, literature that tries to understand why do companies set these targets, like it's voluntary, no one's forcing them to do it, so why do they do it? And one thing that keeps coming up is actually to look attractive to investors. So basically, investors they see it as a risk if you invest in a company that this transition risk. What if it's unlikely to happen in the US tomorrow, but what if governments introduce a carbon tax? Does it mean that a company will go bankrupt? And to sort of mitigate this risk, many investors, they prefer investing in companies that also appear to be transitioning to a low carbon economy, and therefore it's less risky to invest in them, right? And so this is also a sort of mechanism for uptake of these types of absolute reduction targets.
Thank you.
Excellent.
By the way, the website that you put in the chat is really great. Thanks for that. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
I have that for nature as well, if you want, John. So thank you, everyone. This is fantastic. I think everybody really enjoyed this. We could go on, and we would love to, but I know we already took more of your time than you intended, and I'm very grateful for you staying on over the hour with this discussion, because I think the entire community really appreciated this. So thank you, everyone, for coming today. I hope we can, see you again soon. We will look forward to your publication. You said in May, right? Is the more fuller version of the guidance coming out?
Around May, around or after May, I would say.
Okay. So we will keep us posted. I will keep an eye out, but please stay on our list. And we have Daniela coming on Monday, so we're really happy to have both of you in a short interval. Hamza, anybody else who would like to say something before I close the session for today?
Yeah, thank you very much. And probably we will be definitely looking at that. And I think like LCA is a very cumbersome process, and now we have more things to do. We will also be looking on how to automate that. Also, like a question that I wanted to ask is also like tool support. So there were tools like regarding for LCA. Now that you have like new approach to it, I think they're like the tools should, I don't know if they are willing to adapt, want to adopt it, and so on. Do you have already like some tools that
about that as well?
Yeah. Do you have like already like some tool that you use for this? Or table sheet, probably.
Short answer is no. Long answer would take a bit longer to explain. But
Okay.
you can always follow up another time.
Okay, cool.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So we have you already noted for follow-up. Okay. Thank you, everyone. This is wonderful.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you
and
very
thank
much.
you for your time. It was a pleasure.
Ciao.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.